She stayed late after class, guiding a quiet cowboy through every word and line, his rough hands trembling as he tried to read. To her, he was just a humble ranch hand chasing a dream of learning. But what she didn't know was that this cowboy carried more than dust and worn pages. He carried a secret fortune, testing who would see his heart before his wealth. And soon, her kindness would earn her more than she ever taught. The dust came first. It rolled across the valley like something alive, clawing at the wooden edges of Mercy Creek with fingers made of grit and wind. The sky went yellow, then brown, then nothing at all. Just a roaring wall that swallowed the horizon. Clara Wren pressed her palm against the schoolhouse window, feeling the glass shudder beneath her touch. Outside, the town disappeared. The general store, the livery, the crooked steeple of the church, all of it eaten by the storm. She stepped back from the glass, her breath fogging the pain. The oil lamp on her desk flickered, casting shadows that bent and stretched across the rows of empty desks. The children had gone home hours ago, their laughter still lingering in the corners of the room like echoes of warmth. Now there was only the wind, screaming through the cracks in the walls, rattling the door on its hinges. Clara turned toward the stove, where a pot of coffee sat cooling. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and poured herself a cup, the ceramic warm against her palms. The storm would pass. It always did. But tonight, it felt different. Heavier, angrier, like the earth itself was trying to shake something loose. And then the door opened. She spun, coffee sloshing over the rim of her cup, her heart hammering against her ribs. A gust of wind tore through the room, scattering papers from her desk, extinguishing the lamp. Darkness crashed in, thick and suffocating. She heard the door slam shut, heard the scrape of boots against the floorboards, heard breathing, ragged, labored, not her own. "Who's there?" Her voice was steadier than she felt. Silence. Then from the shadows near the door, a shape moved. Slowly, carefully. A man stepped forward into the faint glow of the stove's embers. His hat was pulled low, brim heavy with dust. His coat hung from his shoulders like something that had been dragged through miles of hard country. His hands, scarred and raw, clutched the brim of his hat as he pulled it from his head. "Ma'am." His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. "I'm sorry for the intrusion." Clara's fingers tightened around her cup. She studied him in the half-light, the worn leather of his boots, the frayed cuffs of his sleeves, the way his eyes stayed fixed on the floor, as if looking at her might break something inside him. "The storm," she said, finding her voice again. "You shouldn't be out in it." "No, ma'am." He shifted his weight, his shoulders hunched, making himself smaller. "I know, but I saw the light, thought maybe." He trailed off, his jaw working as if the words cost him something. Clara set her cup down on the nearest desk. She reached for the lamp, striking a match and coaxing the flame back to life. Light spilled across the room again, softer now, and she saw him more clearly. The lines etched deep around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the way his hands trembled as he held his hat. "You need shelter," she said, more statement than question. "No, ma'am." His gaze finally lifted, meeting hers for just a moment before dropping again. I need to learn," she blinked. "Learn? To read." The words came out barely louder than a whisper. "I need to learn to read." The wind howled outside, shaking the walls, but inside the schoolhouse the silence stretched long and thin. Clara's mind turned over his request, trying to make sense of it. Men came to town for work, for whiskey, for land, not for letters. "You want to learn to read," she repeated, as if saying it aloud would make it real. "Yes, ma'am." His knuckles were white where they gripped the brim of his hat. "If you'll teach me." She studied him again, this stranger with dust in his hair and desperation in his voice. There was something in the way he stood, something in the weight of his silence, that told her this wasn't pride speaking. It was something deeper, something that ached. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elias." He paused. "Elias Boone." "Mr. Boone." She gestured toward the nearest desk. "Sit." He hesitated, as if the simple act of sitting in a schoolroom might expose him in ways he wasn't ready for. But then he moved, lowering himself into the desk with the careful deliberation of a man who'd spent his life working fields and wrangling cattle, not sitting still. The desk groaned under his weight, and he folded his hands on top of it, his fingers laced together like he was praying. Clara walked to the blackboard, picking up a piece of chalk. The storm rattled the windows, but she didn't flinch. She drew a letter, large and clear against the dark slate. "This is where we start," she said. Elias stared at the letter as if it were a door he'd been locked out of his entire life. His throat worked, his lips parting, but no sound came. Clara waited, giving him time, giving him space. She'd seen shame before, seen it in the eyes of children who couldn't keep up, seen it in the slump of shoulders when words refused to make sense. But this was different. This was a man who'd lived decades without the tools to name the world around him, and now he was asking for them. She said gently. It sounds like the beginning of apple, or axe. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the board. He repeated, his voice rough but earnest. Good. She wrote another letter beside it. B. They worked through the alphabet that way, one letter at a time, her voice steady and patient, his responses halting but determined. The storm outside raged on, but inside the schoolhouse something quieter took root. When she reached the end of the alphabet, she set the chalk down and turned to face him. Do you know any of these? She asked. He stared at the board, his jaw tight. No, ma'am, not a one. She didn't pity him. Pity would have been an insult. Instead, she nodded, wiping the board clean with the edge of her sleeve. Then we'll start from the beginning, tomorrow, if you come back. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, something like hope, fragile and uncertain. I'll come back. Good. She crossed to her desk, pulling a small book from the drawer. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed and soft from years of handling. She held it out to him. Take this. It's called The Pilgrim's Way. You won't be able to read it yet, but hold on to it. Let it remind you why you're here. Elias took the book with both hands, cradling it as if it might crumble to dust. He stared at the title, at the letters that meant nothing to him yet, and something in his expression shifted, softened. Thank you, he said, and the words sounded like a prayer. The storm began to ease, the wind dropping to a low moan, the dust settling like a veil lifting. Elias stood, tucking the book carefully into the inside pocket of his coat. He placed his hat back on his head, tipping it toward her in a gesture that felt older than the West itself. Tomorrow, then, he said. Tomorrow. He turned and walked to the door, his boots heavy against the floor. He paused with his hand on the latch, his back to her. Ma'am? Yes? Why'd you say yes? To teaching me? Clara considered the question, the weight of it. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear, stars breaking through the last of the clouds. Because you asked, she said simply. He nodded once, as if that was enough, and stepped out into the night. The door closed behind him, and Clara was alone again, the schoolhouse settling back into silence. She walked to the window, watching as his shadow moved through the moonlight, disappearing down the dirt road that led out of town. She didn't know him, didn't know where he'd come from or what had driven him to her door in the middle of a storm. But she knew desperation when she saw it. Knew hunger that wasn't for food, but for something deeper. For dignity, for belonging, for the chance to be more than what the world had decided he was. She turned away from the window, extinguishing the lamp and gathering her things. As she locked the door behind her and stepped into the cool night air, she heard the whispers already beginning. Voices carried on the wind, drifting from the saloon down the street. Saw a stranger go into the schoolhouse. What's he want with the teacher? Man who can't read got no business learnin'. Not at his age. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and walked toward her small cabin at the edge of town, the voices fading behind her. Let them talk. Let them wonder. She'd spent 3 years teaching children their letters, their numbers, their place in a world that often felt too big and too cruel. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she'd done something that mattered, beyond the walls of that schoolhouse. She didn't know if Elias Boone would return. Didn't know if his pride would let him, or if the weight of his shame would drive him back into the hills where men like him disappeared. But as she closed the door to her cabin and lit the fire in her small stove, she found herself hoping. Hoping that tomorrow, when the sun rose over Mercy Creek, she'd see him standing at her door again, hat in hand, ready to learn. And when morning came, and the storm left behind calm skies, Mercy Creek found itself watching that stranger return to class again, and again. The dawn came soft and pink, spilling over the valley like watercolor bleeding across canvas. Clara stood at the window of the schoolhouse, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the town wake. Smoke rose from chimneys, curling into the pale sky. The blacksmith's hammer rang out, a rhythmic pulse that echoed through the empty streets. A few early risers moved along the boardwalk, their faces still creased with sleep, and there, at the edge of the schoolyard, stood Elias Boone. He was early. The children wouldn't arrive for another hour, but he stood there anyway, his hat clutched in both hands, his eyes fixed on the door as if willing it to open. Clara set her tea down and crossed the room, unlocking the door and stepping out onto the porch. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and sage. "Mr. Boone," she said. He looked up, and for a moment she saw relief wash over his face. "Ma'am, come in." He climbed the steps slowly, his boots heavy on the wood, and followed her inside. The schoolhouse was still dim, the morning light not yet strong enough to fill the corners. Clara lit the lamp on her desk and gestured toward the same seat he'd taken the night before. "Coffee?" she asked. "No, ma'am, thank you." She nodded, moving to the blackboard. She picked up the chalk, feeling its familiar weight in her hand, and began to write. The alphabet, again, one letter at a time, slow and deliberate. Elias watched in silence, his eyes tracing each curve and line as if committing them to memory. When she finished, she turned to face him. "Do you remember any of these from last night?" He stared at the board, his brow furrowed. "That one," he said, pointing to the first letter. Good." She wrote it again, larger this time. "And this?" He hesitated, his lips moving silently. "B, yes." She smiled, just a small curve of her mouth, but enough to ease the tension in his shoulders. "We'll go through them again, as many times as it takes." They worked that way for the better part of an hour, her voice steady and patient, his responses slow but earnest. He stumbled over the letters, mixing up D and B, forgetting F entirely. But he didn't give up, didn't look away. And when the children began to arrive, their laughter spilling through the open door, Clara set the chalk down and nodded toward the back of the room. "You can stay," she said. "If you'd like, listen to the lessons." Elias glanced toward the door, where the first of the children were filing in. Boys with dirt on their knees, girls with ribbons in their hair, all of them chattering like sparrows. He shook his head. "Don't want to be in the way." "You won't be." He hesitated, then nodded, rising from the desk and moving to the back corner of the room. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his hat resting on his knee. The children barely noticed him, too busy finding their seats and pulling out their slates. But Clara noticed the way his eyes followed her as she began the day's lesson. Noticed the way his lips moved silently as she read aloud from a primer. Noticed the way his hands gripped his hat a little tighter whenever one of the children stumbled over a word. The morning passed in a blur of arithmetic and spelling, of recitations and penmanship. When the children finally spilled out for their midday break, the room fell quiet again. Elias remained in his corner unmoving, and Clara walked over to him, holding out a slate and a piece of chalk. "Try writing the letters," she said. "Start with a..." He took the slate carefully, as if it might shatter in his hands. He stared at it for a long moment, then lifted the chalk and pressed it to the surface. The line he drew was shaky, uneven, but it was there. An A, crooked and rough but unmistakable. Clara knelt beside him, her skirts pooling on the floor. "That's good," she said quietly. "Now try the next one." He did. And the next, and the next. His hand moved slowly, each letter a struggle, but he didn't stop, didn't complain. When the slate was full, he looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, something like pride. "You're doing well," she said. He nodded, his throat working. "Thank you, ma'am." But outside the schoolhouse walls, the whispers were growing louder. By the time the sun dipped low and the children went home, the saloon was already buzzing with talk. Clara heard it as she walked past on her way to the general store, heard the low rumble of men's voices, the sharp bark of laughter. "Saw him again today," one voice said, "sitting in the schoolhouse, like some kind of overgrown child, man his age, trying to learn letters. It's pitiful. He's chasing her, that's what. Using them lessons as an excuse." Clara's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. Let them talk, let them think what they wanted. She pushed open the door to the general store, the bell above jangling, and stepped inside. The clerk behind the counter, a thin man named Harlan with a sharp nose and sharper tongue, looked up and grinned. "Afternoon, Miss Wren. Mr. Harlan." She moved to the shelves, picking up a bag of flour, a tin of coffee. "Heard you got yourself a new student," Harlan said, his grin widening. "Older fella, name of Boone." Clara didn't look at him. "I teach anyone who wants to learn." Sure. Harlan leaned on the counter, his eyes gleaming. "But a man who can't read at his age? Seems like a waste of time, don't it? Man like that's got no business trying to better himself. Should just stick to what he knows." Clara set the flour and coffee on the counter, meeting his gaze. And what does he know, Mr. Harlan? Harlan shrugged. Cattle, I'd guess. Or digging ditches. Whatever it is folks like him do. Folks like him. You know what I mean. Clara pulled a few coins from her pocket and placed them on the counter. No, she said quietly. I don't think I do. Harlan's grin faltered, and he took the coins without another word. Clara gathered her purchases and walked out, the door swinging shut behind her. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She walked back toward the schoolhouse, her thoughts churning. She didn't know why it bothered her so much, the gossip, the judgment. She'd heard worse over the years, endured worse, but there was something about the way they talked about Elias, as if his desire to learn was something shameful, something to be mocked, that made her chest tighten with anger. When she reached the schoolhouse, she found him still there, sitting at the desk in the fading light, his slate balanced on his knee. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. You're still here, she said. Didn't want to stop, he replied. Not yet. She set her packages down on her desk and lit the lamp. You don't have to explain yourself to me, Mr. Boone. I know. He set the slate aside, rubbing his hands together. But I want you to understand, this ain't easy for me. Coming here, asking for help. I've spent my whole life pretending I didn't need things I couldn't have. And now, he trailed off, his gaze dropping to his hands. Now I'm tired of pretending. Clara crossed the room and sat at the desk beside him. Then don't, she said simply. He looked at her, and for a moment, the air between them felt heavy, weighted with something unspoken. Not romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but recognition. Two people who'd spent years carrying burdens no one else could see, finding each other in a place where burdens were supposed to stay hidden. The town's talking, he said after a moment. Let them. They think I'm a fool. Then they're the fools. He smiled at that, just a faint curve of his mouth, but it softened the hard lines of his face. You got a kind heart, Miss Wren. I have a practical one, she corrected, and it tells me that a man who wants to learn is worth teaching. No matter what anyone else says. He nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the window, where the last light of day was fading into dusk. My hands, he said quietly. They're not made for this, for holding chalk and writing words. They're made for work, hard work, the kind that breaks your back and keeps you too tired to think. Clara looked at his hands, scarred, calloused, the knuckles swollen and rough. Hands that had built things, broken things, survived things. Your hands, she said, are made for whatever you choose to make them for. He turned back to her, and something in his expression cracked open, just a little. You really believe that? I do. They sat in silence for a long moment, the lamplight flickering between them. Outside, the first stars began to appear, bright and sharp against the darkening sky. Elias stood, picking up his hat and turning it in his hands. I'll be back tomorrow, he said. I know. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. Miss Wren, yes, thank you, for not giving up on me. I won't, she said, as long as you don't give up on yourself. He nodded once and stepped out into the night. Clara watched him go, his shadow fading into the darkness, and then turned back to the empty schoolhouse. She extinguished the lamp and locked the door behind her, the weight of the day settling over her shoulders like a shawl. As she walked home beneath the wide, star-filled sky, she thought about Elias Boone, about the quiet determination in his voice, the way his hands shook when he held the chalk, the way he looked at the letters on the board as if they were a map to somewhere he'd been trying to reach his entire life. She didn't know his story, didn't know where he'd come from or what had driven him to Mercy Creek, but she knew enough to see that he was searching for something more than words, something more than letters. And as the night deepened and the town settled into sleep, Clara found herself hoping that whatever he was searching for, he'd find it here. But hope is a fragile thing in Mercy Creek, and the next knock on the schoolhouse door would shatter its calm. Spring crept into the valley like a secret being whispered across the land. The snow that had clung to the distant peaks melted into silver streams that fed the creek, swelling its banks until the water sang over stones worn smooth by time. Wildflowers pushed through the hard earth, purple lupine and Indian paintbrush, bright splashes of color against the endless brown. The cottonwoods along the water's edge unfurled their leaves, and the air grew soft with the scent of sage and wet soil. Mercy Creek woke to the sound of birds. Clara stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, watching the morning light spill across the valley. It had been 6 weeks since Elias Boone first walked through her door, and in that time, something had shifted. Not just in him, though the change was visible there, in the way he held himself a little straighter, in the way his eyes no longer dropped to the floor when he spoke, but in the town itself, in the rhythm of the days. He came every morning before the children arrived, his boots always clean, his hat always in his hands. He'd sit at the same desk in the back corner, his broad shoulders hunched over a slate, his brow furrowed in concentration as he traced letters with the stub of chalk worn smooth by his grip. And when the children filed in, chattering and laughing, he'd move to help Clara, carrying water from the pump, stacking firewood by the stove, mending the broken hinge on the door that had creaked since winter. He never asked for anything, never expected anything. But his presence became a constant, like the sun rising or the wind sweeping down from the hills. Clara poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one on the desk where Elias sat. He looked up, his eyes tired but clear, and nodded his thanks. She watched as he lifted the cup to his lips, his scarred hands steady now where they'd trembled weeks before. "Read it," she said, pointing to the primer open on the desk. He looked down at the page, his lips moving silently as he worked through the words. "The boy ran to the river." His voice was halting, uncertain, but the words were there, real, spoken. "Good," Clara said. "Now the next line." "He saw a..." He paused, his finger hovering over the word. "Fish?" "Yes." A smile flickered across his face, brief but genuine. He saw a fish. Clara felt something warm settle in her chest, pride maybe, or relief. She'd taught dozens of children over the years, watched them stumble through their letters and numbers, watched them grow frustrated and angry, and sometimes give up entirely. But this was different. This was a man who'd lived 40-some years in a world that told him he didn't deserve the luxury of words, and now he was claiming them, one syllable at a time. "Keep going," she said gently. He did, line by line, word by word, until the page was finished and his voice had grown hoarse from the effort. When he finally looked up, the sun had climbed higher, and the children were beginning to arrive outside, their voices carrying through the open windows. "I'll come back this evening," Elias said, standing and reaching for his hat. "If that's all right." "It's all right." He nodded and moved toward the door, but Clara's voice stopped him. "Mr. Boone?" He turned, his hand on the doorframe. "Ma'am, you're doing well, better than you think." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or disbelief. But he didn't argue, just tipped his hat and stepped out into the sunlight, leaving the door open behind him. Clara watched him walk across the yard toward the schoolhouse fence, where a section of rotted wood leaned precariously against the posts. He'd mentioned it the day before, said he'd fix it if she had the nails. She'd found a handful in the supply shed, rusted but still good, and left them on the porch. Now she watched as he knelt in the dirt, pulling the old boards free and measuring new ones against the gap. The children arrived in clusters, the Miller boys with their freckled faces and perpetually dirty hands, Sarah Jennings with her blonde braids and serious eyes, little Thomas Wade who still couldn't quite remember his times tables. They barely glanced at Elias as they filed past, used to his presence now, and Clara felt a small measure of satisfaction at that. He'd become part of the landscape, no longer a stranger but simply a fixture, like the schoolhouse bell or the flag that hung limp in the still morning air. The day unfolded in its familiar rhythm, spelling lessons and arithmetic, penmanship, and recitation. At midday, the children spilled outside for their break, and Clara stood at the window, watching them play. Elias was still working on the fence, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat darkening the back of his shirt. One of the Miller boys, Jacob, the youngest, wandered over, curious, and said something Clara couldn't hear. Elias paused, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, and replied. The boy laughed, and Elias smiled, a real smile, wide and unguarded, before returning to his work. Clara turned away from the window, feeling something she couldn't quite name settle over her. It wasn't happiness exactly, more like peace, the kind that came from small, quiet moments strung together like beads on a thread. By the time the children went home, the fence was mended, the posts driven deep into the earth, the boards straight and secure. Elias stood back, hands on his hips, surveying his work. Clara stepped out onto the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "Looks good," she said. "Should hold through the summer," he replied. "Maybe longer." She descended the steps and walked over to the fence, running her hand along the smooth wood. "You didn't have to do this. I know." He picked up his hat from where it rested on a post and brushed the dust from the brim. "But I wanted to." They stood there in the fading light, the valley stretching out before them, the creek glinting silver in the distance. Clara thought about the past 6 weeks, about the way Elias had woven himself into the fabric of her days without her quite realizing it. The way she'd started pouring 2 cups of coffee in the mornings instead of 1. The way she'd started leaving books on the desk for him to practice with, their pages marked with scraps of paper where he'd struggled and needed help. "You've been kind to me," Elias said, his voice low. "Kinder than I deserved." Clara looked at him, at the lines around his eyes and the gray in his hair, at the way he held his hat like a shield. "Why do you say that?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because kindness is rare, and I've learned not to expect it. Then maybe you've been living in the wrong places." He smiled faintly at that, but there was sadness in it. Maybe. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. Clara felt the cool edge of evening creeping in, the warmth of the day giving way to something softer. She turned to go back inside, but Elias's voice stopped her. "Miss Wren?" She looked back. "Yes? Do you ever wonder why people do the things they do, why they choose the paths they choose?" Clara considered the question, the weight of it. "Sometimes," she said. "But I think most people are just trying to survive, trying to find something that makes the surviving worthwhile." Elias nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he'd been thinking. "And what makes it worthwhile for you?" She looked at the schoolhouse behind her, at the small building with its peeling paint and sagging roof, at the chalkboard visible through the window, and the desks lined up in neat rows. "This," she said simply, "teaching. Knowing that maybe, just maybe, I'm giving someone the tools to build a better life than the one they were handed." "You do," he said quietly. "You give that." Clara felt her throat tighten, and she turned away before he could see the emotion in her eyes. "Come back this evening," she said. "We'll work on writing your name. I will." She climbed the steps and went inside, closing the door softly behind her. Through the window, she watched as Elias stood there a moment longer, his hat in his hands, his face turned toward the dying light. Then he turned and walked away, his shadow stretching long and thin across the ground. That evening he returned as promised. The schoolhouse was quiet, the children long gone, the town settling into the hush that came with dusk. Clara lit the lamps and set out fresh paper and a pen. Not chalk this time, but ink. Elias sat at the desk, staring at the blank page as if it were an impossible task. "Start with the E," Clara said, guiding his hand. "Then the L." He dipped the pen in the inkwell, his hand shaking slightly, and pressed it to the paper. The first letter came out crooked, a wavering line that bled at the edges. But he didn't stop. He kept going, letter by letter, until his name was there in black ink, uneven and rough, but undeniably his. Elias Boone. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Clara, and she saw something in his eyes that made her chest ache, something raw and vulnerable and fierce all at once. "I ain't never written my own name before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not once in my whole life." Clara sat down beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "Now you have—" He nodded, his jaw tight, and she saw the muscles in his throat work as he swallowed hard. "Feels like I'm finally real, like I finally exist." "You've always existed, Mr. Boone, not like this." He touched the paper with one fingertip, tracing the letters he'd written, "Not in a way that matters." They sat in silence for a while, the lamplight flickering between them, the night pressing in against the windows. Outside, the creek murmured its endless song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, its voice rising and falling like a lament. "Tell me something," Clara said after a while. "Something true?" Elias looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Like what? Anything. Something you've never told anyone." He leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his knees, and stared up at the ceiling. "I had a brother once," he said quietly. "Older than me by 3 years. He died when I was 10, drowned in a river trying to save a horse that had broken through the ice." Clara's breath caught. "I'm sorry. He was the smart one. Elias continued, his voice distant. Could read and write and do sums in his head faster than anyone I knew. My pa wanted him to go to school, to make something of himself. But after he died, there wasn't no point. Pa needed me to work, and that was that. He paused, his gaze dropping to the paper in front of him. Sometimes I think I'm learning this for him. So he didn't die for nothing. Clara reached out and placed her hand over his, her touch light but steady. He didn't die for nothing. And neither are you. Elias looked at her hand on his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. Then he turned his hand over, his palm pressing against hers, and they sat like that in the quiet schoolhouse. Two people holding on to something fragile and precious and impossibly rare. Thank you, he said finally. For what? For seeing me. For not turning me away. Clara's throat tightened, and she squeezed his hand gently before letting go. You don't need to thank me for that. But he did. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he looked at her as if she'd given him something he'd been searching for his entire life. And maybe she had. Not just the letters or the words, but the belief that he was worthy of them. That he mattered. The weeks that followed were quiet and steady, a rhythm that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. Elias came every morning and every evening, his lessons growing longer, his confidence building. He read to the children sometimes, stumbling over the words but pushing through, and they listened with rapt attention, as if the act of a grown man struggling to read gave them permission to struggle too. Clara found herself looking forward to those moments. The way his voice would rise with pride when he finished a page, the way his eyes would light up when he understood a word he'd been puzzling over for days. She found herself noticing things she hadn't before. The way he smiled when he thought no one was looking, the way his hands, so scarred and rough, could be gentle when they turned the pages of a book. One evening, as the firelight warmed the room and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elias looked up from the book he was reading and asked, "What does honor mean?" Clara set down the slate she'd been wiping clean and considered the question. "Honor," she said slowly, "is doing what's right even when no one's watching, even when it costs you something." Elias nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And what if you ain't sure what's right? Then you do the best you can with what you know, and you keep trying to learn more." He looked out the window, his gaze distant, and Clara wondered what he was thinking. What memories, or regrets, or questions haunted him in the quiet moments when the rest of the world fell away? She wanted to ask, but something held her back, a sense that whatever burden he carried, he wasn't ready to share it yet. So she waited. And in the waiting, something between them deepened, not into romance, not quite, but into something that felt equally profound. A friendship forged in the shared space between silence and speech, between who they'd been and who they were becoming. The town, meanwhile, had begun to tolerate Elias. Not accept him exactly, but tolerate. They stopped muttering as loudly when he walked past. Stopped sneering quite so openly. He was still a curiosity, still an outsider, but he'd proven himself useful, fixing fences, hauling water, helping the blacksmith one afternoon when the man threw out his back. Slowly, grudgingly, Mercy Creek made space for him, but Clara noticed things they didn't. The way Elias sometimes touched the inside pocket of his coat, as if checking that something was still there. The way he tensed when strangers rode into town, his eyes following them until they left. The way he never talked about where he'd come from or where he was going. One night, as they sat by the fire after a long lesson, Clara finally asked, "Mr. Boone, where did you live before you came here?" He was quiet for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "Nowhere worth mentioning," he said finally. "Everyone comes from somewhere. Not everyone wants to remember it." Clara didn't push. But the question lingered between them, unanswered, a door he wasn't ready to open. Spring deepened into early summer, and the valley bloomed with life. The schoolyard filled with the sound of children's laughter, and the evenings grew long and golden. Clara taught Elias to write full sentences, to read entire pages without stopping. She watched as he transformed, not just in skill but in spirit, as if learning to read had unlocked something inside him that had been caged for too long. And yet, beneath it all, there was a tension she couldn't quite name. A sense that the peace they'd found was temporary, fragile, like glass held up to the light. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared, Elias stood to leave, but he paused at the door, his hand on the latch, his back to Clara. "Miss Wren," he said quietly. "Yes, if I asked you what you'd do if you found out someone wasn't who they said they were, what would you tell me?" Clara's heart stilled. She set down the book she'd been holding and crossed the room to stand beside him. "I'd say that everyone has reasons for the things they do, and that who someone is now matters more than who they were." He turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. "You really believe that?" "I do," he nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the night, leaving Clara standing alone in the schoolhouse, her heart heavy with questions she didn't know how to ask. Outside, the creek sang its endless song, and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. Clara stood in the doorway, watching Elias's shadow fade into the darkness, and felt something shift in the air, a sense that the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. But comfort can't outpace truth, and one rider's arrival from the west would turn Mercy Creek against them both. The carriage came on a Tuesday, when the sun hung white and merciless overhead. Clara heard it before she saw it, the rattle of wheels on the hard-packed road, the sharp clip of hooves moving at a pace that spoke of purpose, not leisure. She was at the blackboard, chalk in hand, explaining fractions to a classroom full of restless children whose minds had already drifted toward the creek and the promise of cool water. The sound pulled her attention to the window, and she paused mid-sentence, her hand frozen in the air. The carriage rolled into view like something from another world. It was black lacquer polished to a mirror shine, with silver trim that caught the sunlight and threw it back in sharp, blinding flashes. The horses were matched bays, their coats gleaming, their tacks studded with brass that jingled with each step. A driver sat ramrod straight on the box, his face hidden beneath the brim of a tall hat, and beside him, a man in a long coat the color of charcoal, his hands folded atop a silver-headed cane. The children turned in their seats, craning their necks to see. Sarah Jennings whispered something to the girl beside her, and Jacob Miller stood up without asking permission, his mouth hanging open. "Sit down, Jacob," Clara said quietly, but her voice had lost its certainty. She set the chalk on the ledge and moved to the window, her heart beginning to beat faster without quite knowing why. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of the general store, and the man in the charcoal coat stepped down with the ease of someone accustomed to being served. He was tall and lean, with silver threading through his dark hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, all sharp angles and cold precision. He straightened his coat, adjusted his cane, and looked around the town with the expression of someone who just stepped in something distasteful. Clara's stomach tightened. The man said something to the driver, who nodded and began tending to the horses. Then he turned and walked toward the saloon, his cane tapping against the boardwalk with each measured step. The town, which had been going about its midday business, went still. Faces appeared in windows. Men stepped out of doorways. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Clara turned back to the children, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Continue reading from page 43. Sarah, you start." But her mind was elsewhere. She watched through the window as the man disappeared into the saloon and a few moments later emerged with the saloon keeper, Mr. Graves, trailing behind him like a dog called to heel. They stood in the street, Graves gesturing toward the schoolhouse, toward the livery, toward the small cluster of buildings that made up Mercy Creek. The man in the charcoal coat listened, his face expressionless, and then nodded once. He turned and looked directly at the schoolhouse. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The man started walking, his cane tapping out a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Clara stepped back from the window, her hands suddenly cold despite the heat. She told herself she was being foolish, that there was no reason for her heart to be racing, no reason for the dread curling in her stomach like smoke. But instinct was a powerful thing, and hers was screaming. The door opened without a knock. The children fell silent, their eyes wide. The man stood in the doorway, backlit by the harsh sunlight, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He removed his hat with one hand, revealing hair slicked back from a high forehead, and his eyes, pale gray like winter ice, swept across the room before landing on Clara. "Miss Clara Wren?" His voice was smooth, cultured, with an accent that spoke of cities and drawing rooms in places far removed from the dust and sweat of the frontier. "Yes," Clara said, lifting her chin. "And you are?" "Alden Reeve." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "Estate manager for the Boone Holdings based out of St. Louis." He paused, letting the name settle in the air like a stone dropped into still water. "I'm looking for a man who may have passed through this town. A man by the name of Elias Boone." The room seemed to tilt. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, felt her hands grip the edge of the desk to keep herself steady. Behind her, the children sat frozen, sensing the shift in the air, the sudden weight of something they didn't understand but could feel pressing down on them. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name," Clara said, and the lie tasted like ash on her tongue. Alden Reeve's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles could cut. "Is that so?" He walked further into the room, his cane tapping softly. "Because the gentleman at the saloon seemed quite certain that a man fitting that description has been spending considerable time here. In your schoolhouse. Learning to read." The way he said the last two words made them sound like an accusation. Clara's mind raced. She thought of Elias, who was supposed to return that evening, thought of the way he'd touched his coat pocket, the way he'd tensed at the sight of strangers, the way he'd asked her what she'd do if someone wasn't who they said they were. "There is a man who comes here to learn," she said carefully, "but I don't make a habit of prying into my students' business." "How noble." Reeve turned, surveying the room with the detached interest of someone appraising livestock. "Tell me, Miss Wren, do you know who Elias Boone is? Truly? He's a man who wants to learn to read. He's the sole heir to one of the largest fortunes west of the Mississippi," Reeve said, his voice sharp as a blade. "His father, Marcus Boone, built an empire in railroads and cattle before his death 3 years ago, an empire that Elias abandoned, walked away from without a word, leaving everything in legal limbo and dozens of people without direction." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Clara's face. "Does that sound like the man you know?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of Elias's scarred hands, his worn boots, the way he'd trembled the first time he'd written his name, the way he'd said, "I ain't never written my own name before, not once in my whole life." "People leave their old lives for many reasons," she said quietly. "Indeed they do." Reeve tilted his head, studying her. "But running away from responsibility is cowardice, Miss Wren, not courage. Maybe he had his reasons." "Oh, I'm sure he did." Reeve's voice dripped with disdain, conscience perhaps, guilt over the way his father ran the business, as if refusing his inheritance would somehow absolve him of the family name. He turned away, walking toward the window. "But intentions don't pay workers' wages, Miss Wren. They don't settle debts or maintain properties. They're just pretty words that allow weak men to sleep at night." Clara felt anger flare hot in her chest. "You don't know him, and you do?" Reeve turned back, his eyebrows raised. "Because he sat in your classroom and played the humble cowboy? Because he fixed your fence and smiled at your students?" He shook his head. "He's been testing you, Miss Wren, testing this entire town, seeing if anyone would show him kindness without knowing who he was, without knowing what he was worth." The words hit her like a physical blow. Testing. The room swam for a moment, and Clara gripped the desk harder. Behind her, she heard one of the children whisper, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. "That's not," she started, but Reeve cut her off. "Not true? Then why did he hide his identity? Why come here to this forgotten little town and pretend to be something he's not?" Reeve's voice softened, became almost pitying. "I understand, Miss Wren. You're a kind woman, a good woman, and he took advantage of that kindness. But now it's time for him to face reality, to return to St. Louis and take up the responsibilities he abandoned. He doesn't want that life. What he wants is irrelevant." Reeve straightened, adjusting his coat. "The estate is legally his. The workers depend on it, and I've been tasked with bringing him back to fulfill his obligations." He moved toward the door, then paused. "When you see him, and I know you will, tell him I'm waiting at the hotel. Tell him he has until tomorrow evening to present himself. After that, I'll take more direct measures. You can't force him to go with you." Reeve looked back at her, and his smile was cold. "Can't I?" He placed his hat back on his head. "Good day, Miss Wren. I do hope your student learned something valuable from your lessons, though I suspect the only lesson he needed was one he already knew, that money can't buy integrity, but it can certainly buy isolation." He walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Clara stood frozen, her mind reeling, her heart a wild thing in her chest. The children stared at her, waiting for direction, for explanation, but she had none to give. She moved on instinct, her voice hollow. "Class dismissed," she said. "Go home." They didn't argue. They gathered their things, quickly, quietly, and filed out, casting worried glances back at her as they went. When the last child was gone, Clara sank into her chair, her hands shaking. Testing. The word echoed in her mind, sharp and cutting. She thought of every morning Elias had arrived before dawn, every evening he'd stayed late, thought of the way he'd held the book she'd given him like it was sacred, the way he'd written his name with trembling hands, the way he'd asked her what honor meant. Had it all been a test? An experiment to see if people would be kind to a man who appeared to have nothing? Her throat tightened with tears she refused to shed. She wanted to believe it wasn't true, wanted to believe that the man she'd taught, the man she'd watched transform over the past weeks, was real. But doubt crept in like winter cold, seeping through the cracks in her certainty. The afternoon dragged on in agonizing slowness. Clara tried to busy herself with grading papers, with organizing books, with anything that would keep her hands occupied and her mind from spiraling. But every sound made her jump, every shadow at the window made her heart lurch. When the sun finally began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust, she heard footsteps on the porch. Elias appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his face open and familiar. "Evening, Miss Wren," he said, and his voice was the same as always, low, rough, honest. Or was it? Clara stood slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Mr. Boone," he frowned, sensing the shift in her tone. "Something wrong? You tell me." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Are you Elias Boone of the Boone Holdings, heir to a fortune in St. Louis?" The color drained from his face, his hands tightened around the brim of his hat, and for a long moment he didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there in the doorway like a man who'd been struck. "Who told you?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "A man named Alden Reeve. He's staying at the hotel, says he's here to bring you back." Elias closed his eyes, his jaw tight. "Of course he is. Is it true?" Clara heard the tremor in her voice and hated it. Everything he said. "Is it true?" "Yes." The word came out flat, heavy. "It's true." Clara felt something crack inside her chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I—" He stopped, opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression so raw it made her ache. "Because I needed to know—" "Know what?" "If anyone would see me, really see me, without the money, without the name, without all the weight that comes with being a Boone." He took a step forward, then stopped, as if afraid she'd run if he came closer. "My father built that empire on the backs of men he paid barely enough to survive, men who worked themselves to death while he counted his profits. And when he died, everyone expected me to just step into his shoes, to keep the machine running, but I couldn't." His voice broke. "I couldn't be him. So you ran." "I left," he corrected, his eyes flashing. "I left because staying would have destroyed me, would have made me into something I couldn't live with." Clara shook her head, tears burning behind her eyes. "You lied to me, to all of us. I never lied about who I was. I just didn't tell you who I'd been." "That's the same thing." "No." He moved closer, desperate now. "No, it's not. Every word I spoke to you was true. Every lesson, every conversation. That was me. The real me. Not the man my father wanted me to be. Not the heir everyone expected, but me." Clara turned away, unable to look at him. "Mr. Reeve said you were testing us." "Testing me? That's not—" Elias's voice broke again, and she heard him take a shaky breath. "I wasn't testing you. I was saving myself. And maybe I was hoping someone would prove that kindness still existed without money poisoning it." "So you used us?" "No." The word came out sharp, anguished. "I came here broken, Clara. I came here because I'd lost faith in everything. In people, in goodness, in the idea that humanity was worth a damn. And you," his voice softened, "you gave me that faith back. You didn't do it because I was rich or important. You did it because it was right. Because you saw a man who needed help, and you helped him." Clara turned back to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks now. And what happens now? Reeve says you have until tomorrow evening to go with him. Elias's face hardened. I'm not going back. He says he'll take direct measures. Let him try. Elias, I won't go back to that life, Clara. I can't. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the desperation in his eyes. Everything I've built here, everything I've become, that's real. That matters. The rest of it, the money, the estate, the name, it's poison. But people depend on that estate, workers, families. He flinched as if she'd struck him. I know, he said quietly. God help me, I know. They stood in silence, the weight of it pressing down on them like a physical thing. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the schoolhouse filled with shadows. Clara wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, her heart a tangled mess of anger and hurt and something deeper she didn't want to name. You should have told me, she said finally. I deserve to know. You're right. His voice was thick with emotion. You did. And I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth in his face. Saw the man who'd sat in that desk morning after morning, struggling with letters that children mastered in weeks. Saw the man who'd fixed her fence and helped her carry water and read to the children with a voice that shook from the effort. Saw the man who'd asked her what honor meant and held her answer like it was scripture. And beneath the hurt, beneath the betrayal, she saw something else. She saw a man who'd walked away from a fortune because his conscience wouldn't let him sleep. Who'd come to a forgotten town and asked for help from a stranger because he'd run out of options and hope both. What are you going to do? She asked quietly. I don't know. He looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. But I know I can't stay here. Not now. Reeve won't stop, and the town, he swallowed hard. The town will turn on me. On you for helping me. I won't let that happen. So you'll just leave? Again? If it keeps you safe, yes. Clara's throat tightened. I don't need you to protect me. Maybe not, but I need to try. He moved toward the door, and panic flared in Clara's chest. Wait. He paused, his back to her. Where will you go? Does it matter? Yes, she said, and her voice cracked. It matters. He turned to look at her one last time, and the expression on his face nearly broke her. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything you gave me. It was more than I deserved. Elias, but he was already gone, stepping out into the gathering darkness. Clara ran to the door, but by the time she reached it, he'd vanished into the shadows, swallowed by the night like he'd never been there at all. She stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming down her face. Behind her, the schoolhouse felt too big, too empty. Ahead of her, the town was beginning to light its lamps, soft glows appearing in windows like distant stars. And somewhere out there, Elias Boone was walking away from the only place that had shown him kindness, because kindness, he'd learned, always came with a price. By morning, the news had spread like wildfire. Clara woke to whispers outside her cabin, to voices sharp with judgment and gleeful with scandal. When she walked to the schoolhouse, she felt eyes following her, felt the weight of the town's condemnation settling over her shoulders like a yoke. The saloon keeper, Mr. Graves, stopped her on the boardwalk. Heard you've been teaching that rich man, he said, his voice loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. Playing charity for a man who could buy this whole town twice over. I didn't know who he was, Clara said quietly. Didn't you? A woman's voice, Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's wife, rang out. Or did you think you might get something out of it? A wealthy husband, perhaps? Clara's cheeks burned. That's not... She made fools of us all, someone else said, pretending to be so high and mighty while she cozies up to money. I didn't know, Clara repeated, but her voice was lost in the rising tide of anger and accusation. By noon, the school board had called an emergency meeting. By evening, they'd asked for her resignation. Clara sat in her empty classroom, staring at the blackboard where Elias had traced his first letters, and felt the world she'd built crumbling around her. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the town, Elias Boone stood on land that bore his name, surrounded by wealth he'd never wanted, and realized that running from your past didn't make it disappear. It only meant you'd have to face it alone. And as the stagecoach vanished into the horizon, Clara's classroom felt emptier than ever, until she found the letter he left behind. The letter sat on Clara's desk like an accusation. She found it the next morning when she arrived at the schoolhouse, tucked beneath the slate where Elias had practiced writing his name. The envelope was plain, unsealed, and her name was written across the front in handwriting that wavered and climbed unevenly across the paper, the script of someone still learning, still fighting for every letter. Miss Clara Wren. Her hand shook as she picked it up. The schoolhouse was cold, the stove unlit, and pale dawn light filtered through the windows, turning everything gray and insubstantial. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through the events of the previous day, through Alden Reeves' cold smile and Elias's stricken face and the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her like stones. She sat at her desk and unfolded the letter. The paper crinkled softly, and she could see where the ink had smudged in places, where his hand had dragged across wet letters. Her eyes stung as she began to read. Dear Miss Wren, I am writing this because I do not have the courage to say it to your face. You taught me to write so I could speak when words failed me. Now I understand why. You asked me why I did not tell you the truth. The answer is simple and also not simple at all. I did not tell you because I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew who I was, who I had been, you would see only the money and the name. You would see my father's cruelty and assume it was mine too. You would see the weight of the Boone legacy and decide I was not worth the trouble. But you taught me anyway. You saw a man who could not read his own name and you did not turn away. You did not pity me or mock me. You simply gave me the tools I needed to be better, to be more. You taught me more than words, Miss Wren. You taught me what it means to be human again, to be worthy of kindness, to believe that the world holds more good than bad if you know where to look for it. I am leaving Mercy Creek. I have to. Not because Reeve demands, but because staying would hurt you more than my leaving ever could. The town has already turned against you. I heard the whispers yesterday. I saw the way they looked at you. I will not be the reason you lose everything you have built. I know you think I was testing you, testing the town. Maybe part of me was. But mostly I was testing myself, trying to see if I could survive without the armor of wealth, trying to see if anyone would choose to know me when I had nothing to offer but my presence and my labor. You chose me, even when I was nothing, even when I had nothing, and that means more to me than any fortune ever could. I am going back to St. Louis, not because I want to, but because I must. There are people who depend on the estate, workers and families who have done nothing wrong except have the misfortune of being tied to the Boone name. I cannot abandon them a second time. But I will not run the business the way my father did. I will tear it down if I have to, burn it to ash and rebuild it into something that does not destroy the people it touches. Keep the schoolhouse, Miss Wren. Keep teaching. Keep being the light in the darkness for people like me who have forgotten how to see. I am keeping your chalk, the one I used to write my name for the first time. I hope you do not mind. It is the only thing I will take with me that matters. Thank you. For everything. For seeing me. For not giving up when I deserved it. For being exactly who you are. Yours in gratitude, Elias Boone. Clara read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears that she refused to let fall. Her throat ached with the effort of holding them back. The words swam on the page, and she traced one finger over his signature, his name written in the same uneven script, but written nonetheless. A name he'd claimed because she'd taught him how. Outside, the town was beginning to wake. She heard the creak of doors opening, the murmur of voices, the rattle of wagons moving along the main street. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of her dress, over her heart, and stood. The stove needed lighting. The floor needed sweeping. There were lessons to prepare, even though she knew no students would come, even though the school board had asked her to resign, even though the town had decided she was guilty of something she couldn't quite name, of being fooled, perhaps, or of caring for the wrong person at the wrong time. But she lit the stove anyway, swept the floor anyway, wrote the day's lesson on the blackboard in careful, precise letters. Because Elias had been right about one thing, she was the light in the darkness. And even if that light was unwanted now, even if it illuminated nothing but empty desks and closed doors, she would keep it burning. The morning passed in silence. No children arrived. No parents knocked to explain their absence. Clara sat at her desk, her hands folded, and waited for a knock that never came. At noon, she ate bread and cheese she'd brought from home, tasting nothing. When the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, she finally rose and locked the door behind her. The walk through town was a gauntlet. People stopped talking when she passed, turned away, whispered behind their hands. Mrs. Patterson crossed the street rather than share the boardwalk with her. Mr. Harlan watched from the window of the general store, his expression smug. Even the children, her students, looked away when their parents pulled them close, as if kindness itself might be contagious. Clara kept her head high, her spine straight, and walked to the small church at the edge of town where the school board was meeting. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. 4 men sat around a table: the preacher, the saloon keeper, the banker, and the mayor. They looked up as she entered, their expressions ranging from discomfort to open hostility. "Miss Wren," the mayor said, clearing his throat, "we weren't expecting you." "I know." Clara moved to stand at the foot of the table. "But I wanted to hear you say it to my face." The men exchanged glances. The preacher, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, spoke first. "We've decided to accept your resignation effective immediately. I never offered one. Then consider this a dismissal." The banker, a portly man named Horace Kimball, leaned back in his chair. "You've brought scandal to this town, Miss Wren. Consorting with that man, teaching him in secret." "I taught him in the schoolhouse," Clara interrupted, her voice sharp. "The same place I teach every child in this town. There was nothing secret about it. You knew who he was," the saloon keeper said. "You had to." "I didn't. Not until yesterday." "Convenient," Kimball muttered. Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I have served this town for 3 years. I have taught your children to read and write and think. I have asked for nothing in return except the respect due to someone who does honest work. And now, because I showed kindness to a man you've decided is unworthy, you're throwing me aside like yesterday's rubbish." The mayor shifted uncomfortably. "It's not personal, Miss Wren. It's about the reputation of the school. Parents are concerned. Parents are hypocrites." The words came out cold and hard. "Every one of you sitting here would have bent over backward to accommodate Elias Boone if you'd known he was rich, would have invited him to dinner, offered him business deals, smiled and bowed and scraped. But because he came here with nothing, because he asked for help like any decent human being might, you've decided he's a villain, and I'm guilty by association." Silence fell over the room. The preacher removed his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief. The mayor stared at his hands. Only Kimball met her gaze, his jaw tight. "You're dismissed, Miss Wren," he said. "Clear out your things by the end of the week." Clara felt something inside her go very still, very cold. "Fine," she said quietly. "But know this, you're not punishing me. You're punishing every child in this town, who will now go without a teacher because you were too small-minded to see past your own prejudice." She turned and walked out before they could respond, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The door closed behind her with a decisive click, and she stood on the church steps breathing hard, her hands shaking with anger and grief and something that felt dangerously close to despair. The town spread out before her, familiar and foreign all at once. She'd thought she'd built a life here, thought she'd found a place where she mattered. But Elias had been right. Kindness always came with a price. And Mercy Creek had decided she'd paid it in full. She walked home as the sun began its descent, the sky bleeding orange and gold. Her cabin sat at the edge of town, a small structure with a single room and a porch that overlooked the valley. She climbed the steps and sank into the rocking chair, pulling Elias's letter from her pocket and reading it again in the fading light. "Keep being the light in the darkness." She closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks at last. How was she supposed to be a light when the world kept trying to extinguish her? But even as the thought formed, she knew the answer. She'd told Elias once that honor meant doing what was right even when no one was watching, even when it cost you something. And teaching, really teaching, the kind that changed lives, had always been her answer to that question. So if the town wouldn't let her teach in the schoolhouse, she'd teach somewhere else. The idea came slowly, but once it took root, it grew with stubborn determination. There was a barn on the outskirts of town, abandoned for years, its roof half-caved and its walls weathered gray. But it had 4 walls and space enough for a handful of students. She could clean it out, patch the roof, bring in benches and slates, and the children, not all of them would stay away. Some had parents who cared more about education than gossip. Some had nowhere else to go. The orphans at the church, the workers' children from the outlying farms, the ones who fell through the cracks because they didn't fit the town's narrow definition of deserving, she would teach them. Clara opened her eyes and looked out at the valley, at the endless expanse of sky and land. The sun had set now, and stars were beginning to appear, pinpricks of light against the gathering dark. She thought of Elias, wherever he was. Thought of him standing in some grand house in St. Louis, surrounded by luxury he didn't want, carrying the weight of a legacy he'd tried to escape. She hoped he was all right. Hoped he found a way to live with the choice he'd made. Hoped he knew that what they'd built together in that schoolhouse, the trust, the learning, the quiet recognition of two people trying to be better than the world expected, had been real. And then she stood, folded the letter carefully, and went inside to begin planning her next move. 300 miles to the east, Elias Boone stood in the study of his father's house, his house now, and felt like he was suffocating. The room was all dark wood and leather, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a manicured garden. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following him as he moved. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface empty except for a single ledger and a pen that probably cost more than most men made in a month. Alden Reeves stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression neutral. "The workers are expecting you to address them tomorrow," he said. "They need reassurance that the estate will continue operating as it has." "It won't," Elias said. Reeve turned, one eyebrow raised. "I beg your pardon? It won't continue operating as it has." Elias moved to the desk, his fingers trailing across the smooth wood. "My father paid starvation wages and worked men until they dropped. That ends now. Mr. Boone, your father built this empire on the backs of people he saw as tools, not human beings." Elias looked up, his eyes hard. "I've seen what poverty does, Reeve. I've lived in it for the past 3 years, and I will not perpetuate it." Reeve's mouth thinned. "The profit margins. I don't care about profit margins. I care about doing what's right. With all due respect, sir, righteousness doesn't pay wages." "No," Elias agreed, "but fair wages do. And that's what these people will get from now on. Fair wages, reasonable hours, safe working conditions. If the business can't survive that way, then it doesn't deserve to survive." Reeves stared at him for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "As you wish. I'll have the accountants draw up revised contracts." "Good." Elias turned away, his gaze drifting to the window. Beyond the manicured garden, beyond the iron gates, the city sprawled in all its gritty, complicated glory. Somewhere out there, people were struggling to survive, were working themselves to exhaustion for pennies, were trapped in a system designed to keep them powerless, and he had the means to change that. Not everywhere, not all at once, but here, in this corner of the world where his name still meant something, he could make a difference. It wasn't the life he wanted, but maybe, he thought, it was the life he was meant for. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the piece of chalk Clara had given him, worn smooth now, barely longer than his thumb. He turned it over in his fingers, remembering the way she'd watched him write his name for the first time. The way she'd smiled, small and genuine, when he'd finished the page. The way she'd said, "You're doing well, better than you think." He'd left her to face the town's judgment alone, left her to bear the consequences of his choices, and that knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to dislodge. But he'd also left her the truth, left her the letter that had taken him 3 hours to write, his hand cramping as he struggled with words that still felt foreign on the page. Left her the only explanation he could offer for why he'd done what he'd done. He hoped it was enough, hoped she understood, hoped she didn't hate him. But even if she did, even if she never forgave him, he would carry what she'd given him for the rest of his life, the belief that he was more than his name, more than his father's legacy, that he was worthy of kindness not because of what he owned, but because of who he chose to be. "Mr. Boone?" Reeves' voice pulled him back to the present. "Is there anything else you need this evening?" Elias looked down at the chalk in his hand, then tucked it back into his pocket. "No," he said quietly. "That'll be all." Reeve left, closing the door softly behind him. Elias stood alone in the vast study, surrounded by the trappings of wealth he'd never wanted, and made himself a promise. He would stay. He would do the work. He would transform this empire into something his conscience could live with. But he would not become his father. Would not let the weight of the Boone name crush the man Clara Wren had helped him become. He moved to the desk and sat down, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. He dipped the pen in ink and began to write. Not to Clara, though he wanted to. She deserved space, deserved time to heal from the wounds his presence had caused. Instead, he wrote to his lawyers. Instructions for selling the St. Louis mansion, for liquidating properties that serve no purpose beyond ego, for redirecting funds into worker housing and education programs, for establishing a trust that would support schools in forgotten towns like Mercy Creek, places where children grew up without books or hope. He wrote until his hand ached and the candles burned low, wrote until the weight in his chest eased just enough to let him breathe, wrote until he could almost believe that what he was doing mattered. And when he finally set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, exhausted and hollowed out, he thought of Clara sitting in that empty schoolhouse, waiting for students who would never come. Thought of her walking through that hostile town with her head held high. Thought of her deciding, despite everything, to keep teaching. She was stronger than he'd ever been, braver, better, and the best thing he could do for her now was stay away. Let her build her life without the shadow of the Boone name hanging over it. Let her be the light she was always meant to be, even if it meant he'd spend the rest of his life in darkness. Weeks passed like water through cupped hands. Clara cleaned out the old barn, sweeping away years of dust and decay. She patched the roof with boards salvaged from abandoned homesteads. She built benches from scrap wood and begged slates from the general store, enduring Harlan's smirk as he handed them over. And slowly, carefully, students began to trickle in. First came the orphans, 3 children from the church who had nowhere else to go. Then the youngest Miller boy, Jacob, whose mother defied her husband to send him. Then a girl from a homestead 10 miles out, who rode in on a mule every morning because her parents believed education was sacred. It wasn't much. 6 students where she'd once had 20. A drafty barn where she'd once had a proper schoolhouse. But it was something. It was hers, and no one could take it from her. She taught with a fierceness she hadn't known she possessed. Taught reading and writing and arithmetic, yes, but also taught kindness and resilience, and the belief that who you were mattered more than where you came from. She taught them the lesson Elias had taught her, that dignity wasn't something you were born with, but something you claimed, one choice at a time. And at night, when the students went home and the barn fell quiet, she would pull out Elias's letter and read it by lamplight, her fingers tracing the uneven words. She didn't know if he was all right, didn't know if he'd kept his promise to change the estate, didn't know if he ever thought of her the way she thought of him, with a complicated tangle of anger and loss and something deeper that she couldn't quite name. But she knew one thing: he had changed her, had shown her that teaching wasn't just about transferring knowledge, but about recognizing the humanity in another person, about refusing to give up on someone just because the world had decided they weren't worth the effort. And that lesson she carried with her into every new day. The sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, watching her students walk home along the dusty road, their voices rising in laughter and song. Behind her, the chalkboard bore the day's lesson in neat, careful script. Ahead of her, the world stretched wide and uncertain, but she wasn't afraid anymore, because Elias had been right about one thing: she was the light in the darkness. And even when everything else was stripped away, the schoolhouse, the town's approval, the comfortable certainty of her old life, that light remained, steady, unbroken, hers. And as autumn winds swept through the valley, a rider returned to Mercy Creek, but this time with nothing left to hide. The first snow came early that year, dusting the valley in white like a promise whispered too soon. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, watching the flakes drift down in the stillness of late afternoon. The students had gone home an hour before, their laughter still echoing in the empty space behind her. She pulled her shawl tighter and breathed in the cold air, sharp and clean in her lungs. It had been 3 months since Elias left, 3 months since the town turned its back on her, 3 months since she'd rebuilt her life from ash and stubbornness, teaching in a barn that leaked when it rained and froze when the wind blew hard from the north. But it was hers, and that meant something. She was about to close the door when she saw him. A figure on horseback, moving slowly down the main road into town. The horse was dark, its breath steaming in the cold air, and the rider sat hunched in the saddle, his hat pulled low. Even from this distance, even through the curtain of falling snow, Clara knew him. Elias. Her heart lurched, a wild, painful thing in her chest. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white, and watched as he rode past the saloon, past the general store, past the schoolhouse that now sat empty and dark, its windows like hollow eyes staring at nothing. He didn't stop, didn't look around, just kept riding until he reached the old schoolhouse, and there he dismounted, slow and stiff, like a man who'd been in the saddle too long. Clara watched as he stood there for a moment, staring at the building. Then he walked to the door and tried the handle. Locked. He stepped back, his shoulders sagging, and for a long moment he just stood there in the falling snow, a dark shape against the white. And then he turned and started walking. Not back to his horse, but toward the edge of town. Toward the barn. Toward her. Clara's breath caught. She wanted to step back inside, to close the door and pretend she hadn't seen him, wanted to run to him, to demand answers, to understand why he'd come back. But she did neither. She just stood there, frozen, as he crossed the distance between them. He stopped 10 feet away, his hat in his hands. Snow gathered on his shoulders, melting into the worn fabric of his coat. His face was thinner than she remembered, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But they were the same eyes that had looked at her across the schoolhouse, that had held hope and shame and gratitude all at once. "Miss Wren," he said, and his voice was rough, uncertain. "Mr. Boone," her voice was steadier than she felt. "I know I got no right to be here," he said. "I know that. But I needed—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I needed to see it through, see what I started." He gestured toward the town behind him. "What I broke." Clara's jaw tightened. "You didn't break anything that wasn't already broken. I broke your life here. Cost you the schoolhouse. Cost you—" "I rebuilt," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I'm still teaching. Still doing the work. What you cost me was comfort, Mr. Boone, not purpose." He flinched, but he didn't look away. "You're right. And I'm sorry, sorrier than words can say." "Then why are you here?" "To fix what I can." He looked past her into the barn, at the rough benches and the chalkboard propped against the wall. "And to finish what I started, which is building something that matters. Something that lasts." He turned back to her, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Resolve hard and unwavering. "I went back to St. Louis, took over the estate like Reeve wanted, but I didn't run it the way my father did. I tore it apart, Miss Wren, sold the mansion, liquidated properties, restructured wages, made enemies of every businessman who thought exploitation was just good sense." Clara stared at him. "Why?" "Because you taught me what honor means, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to live up to it." He took a step closer. "I've spent the last 3 months setting things in motion, trusts for worker housing, education funds for children whose parents can't afford school, fair wages and safe conditions. It's not perfect, it's not enough, but it's a start." "That's admirable," Clara said carefully. "But it doesn't explain why you're here, because none of it meant anything if I didn't come back." His voice dropped, became something raw and honest. "If I didn't face the people I'd hurt, if I didn't try to make it right—" "You can't make it right, Elias. The damage is done. Maybe, but I can try to build something better from the ruins." He looked at the barn again, then back at her. "I bought the old schoolhouse from the town, paid 3 times what it's worth, and I'm donating it back to you, under the condition that it be renamed the Mercy Creek School of Letters, open to any child who wants to learn, regardless of whether their parents can pay." Clara's breath stopped. "You did what?" "I also bought the land around it. Enough for a library, maybe. Or a boarding house for students who live too far to travel every day. Whatever you think the town needs." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, holding it out to her. "It's all in here, signed and legal. The deed's in your name." Clara stared at the paper in his hand, her mind reeling. "I don't understand." "I never tested you," Elias said quietly, "not the way Reeve made it sound. But I did come here looking for something, looking to see if people could be kind without expecting something in return. And you were. You gave me dignity when I had nothing to offer you. You taught me when teaching me cost you everything." His voice cracked. "So now I'm giving back. Not to test you, not to prove anything, but because it's right, because you deserve it." Clara's hands shook as she took the document. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the legal language, the signatures, the deed transferring ownership of the schoolhouse and 5 surrounding acres to her name. It was real, all of it. "Why didn't you just send this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why come back? Because hiding behind money is the coward's way, and I've been a coward long enough." He looked at her, and she saw tears gathering in his eyes. "I needed to see you, needed to apologize face to face, needed to know that you're all right. I'm all right. The words came out harder than she intended. I survived. That's what we do out here, Mr. Boone. We survive. You do more than that, he said. You give hope. You change lives. You're everything I wanted to be and never could. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth in his face, saw the weight he'd been carrying, the guilt and the grief and the desperate need to be forgiven. And beneath her anger, beneath the hurt that still ached like a wound not quite healed, she felt something else, understanding. Because she'd been angry at him for leaving, for not trusting her with the truth from the beginning, for letting her believe he was someone he wasn't. But standing here now, watching him hold his hat in shaking hands while snow gathered on his shoulders, she understood. He'd been drowning, and he'd come to Mercy Creek looking for air. What are you going to do now? She asked quietly. Stay. The word came out firm, decided. If you'll let me, if the town will let me. I'm done running. The town won't make it easy. I know. They'll judge you, call you names. Some of them will never forgive you. I know that too. He met her eyes. But I'm not doing this for their forgiveness. I'm doing it because it's right, and because I want to finish what I started in that schoolhouse. I want to learn to read fluently. I want to be able to write letters without struggling over every word. He stopped, his throat working. I want to be the man you believed I could be. Clara felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. You already are, Elias. His face crumpled, just for a moment, and she saw how close he was to breaking. I don't deserve your kindness. Maybe not. But I'm giving it anyway. She stepped back, opening the barn door wider. Come inside. It's cold. He hesitated, as if afraid she might change her mind. Then he followed her into the barn, and the warmth from the small stove wrapped around them like a blanket. Clara set the deed on her makeshift desk and turned to face him. If you stay, she said, people will talk. They'll say you're trying to buy your way back into their good graces. They'll say I'm only tolerating you because of the money. Let them talk. It'll be hard. I've lived in mansions, surrounded by people who smiled to my face and despised me behind my back. I think I can handle a town that's honest about its contempt. He smiled faintly, and it was tired but real. Besides, I've gotten used to hard work. Clara studied him for a long moment. Then she moved to the chalkboard and picked up a piece of chalk. All right, she said. Let's see what you remember. She wrote a sentence on the board, clear and simple. The man came home to make things right. Elias stepped closer, his eyes scanning the words. His lips moved silently, and then he read aloud, slow but steady. The man came home to make things right. Good, Clara said. Now write it. She handed him the chalk, and he took it with the same reverence he'd shown the first time. He moved to the board and began to write, his hand steadier than it had been months ago, the letters more even. It still wasn't perfect. Some letters climbed too high, others dipped too low, but it was his, real and honest and earned. When he finished, he stepped back and they both stood there looking at the words he'd written. The man came home to make things right. It's a start, Clara said quietly. It is. He turned to look at her, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that healing took time. That trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt brick by brick, word by word, choice by choice. Come back tomorrow morning, Clara said. Before the students arrive, we'll continue your lessons. You sure? I'm sure. He nodded, his throat working. Thank you, Miss Wren. Clara, she said. If we're going to do this, you should call me Clara. He smiled then, small but genuine. Clara. He left as the snow began to fall harder, his figure disappearing into the white. Clara stood in the doorway, watching until he was gone, and then closed the door and leaned against it, her heart a complicated mess of hope and fear, and something that felt dangerously close to forgiveness. The next morning, Elias arrived before dawn just as he'd promised, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. The town watched with narrowed eyes and sharp tongues. They whispered on the boardwalks, muttered in the saloon. Some said he was trying to buy back his reputation. Others said Clara was a fool for taking him back. The school board held meetings to discuss whether accepting his donation was appropriate. The preacher gave a sermon about false prophets and wolves in sheep's clothing, but Elias didn't respond, didn't defend himself. He just showed up every morning at the barn, sat at the back like he'd done before, and worked through his lessons with quiet determination. And when Clara's students arrived, the handful who still came despite their parents' disapproval, he helped carry firewood and haul water and mend the leaks in the roof. He didn't ask for gratitude, didn't ask for forgiveness. He just worked. And slowly, grudgingly, the town began to notice. They noticed when he hired local men to repair the old schoolhouse, paying them wages higher than they'd ever earned. Noticed when he bought supplies for Clara's barn classroom without fanfare or expectation of thanks. Noticed when he spent his afternoons at the edge of town, building a fence around the small cemetery where forgotten graves had been overtaken by weeds. He wasn't trying to win them over. He was just doing what needed to be done. One afternoon, as Clara taught her students their spelling words, she looked up and saw a figure standing in the doorway. Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's wife, her face tight and uncertain. "Miss Wren," she said. "Might I have a word?" Clara excused herself and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cold, the sky a brilliant blue. Mrs. Patterson fidgeted with the edges of her shawl, not meeting Clara's eyes. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally, "for the things I said about you and Mr. Boone. It wasn't Christian of me." Clara waited. "My Samuel," Mrs. Patterson continued. "He's been watching Mr. Boone work on the schoolhouse. Says the man works harder than any 3 men he knows. Says he don't complain or put on airs. Just does the work." She looked up then, her eyes wet, and I realized I judged him without knowing him, judged you without understanding, and that was wrong. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "That means more than you know." Mrs. Patterson nodded. Would you consider teaching Samuel again? In the new schoolhouse, once it's ready? I know I got no right to ask, but he misses learning. Misses you." Clara felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Of course. Tell Samuel he's always welcome." Mrs. Patterson's face crumpled with relief. Thank you. She left, and Clara stood there in the cold, watching her go. It wasn't much. One apology, one student returning. But it was something. A crack in the wall the town had built between them. And cracks, Clara knew, were where the light got in. By the time winter deepened and the valley lay blanketed in snow, the old schoolhouse had been transformed. New windows, new floors, new benches built from strong pine. Elias worked alongside the hired men, his hands blistered and raw, his face weathered by the wind. And when it was finished, when the bell was hung and the flag was raised and the sign above the door read, "The Mercy Creek School of Letters," in letters that gleamed with fresh paint, the town gathered to see it. Not everyone came. Some stayed away out of stubbornness, out of pride. But enough came that the schoolyard felt full, felt alive. Families who'd kept their children home began to reconsider. Men who'd called Elias a coward grudgingly admitted he'd done good work. And when Clara stood on the porch of the new schoolhouse, her students gathered around her and spoke about the importance of education and second chances and the courage it took to make things right. She saw Elias standing at the back of the crowd, his hat in his hands, tears streaming down his face. He'd come back not to test them, but to prove to himself that redemption was possible, that a man could be more than his mistakes, that kindness, even when undeserved, could change the world. And as the sun set over Mercy Creek, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose, Clara caught his eye across the crowd. She nodded once. A small, deliberate gesture. Forgiveness earned. That night, as the town drifted toward sleep and the stars appeared bright and cold overhead, Clara sat at her desk in the new schoolhouse and pulled out Elias's letter, the one he'd written all those months ago. She read it one last time, her fingers tracing the uneven script, and then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Some things, she thought, were meant to be kept. Not as reminders of pain, but as evidence of transformation. Proof that people could change, if they wanted it badly enough, if they were willing to do the work. Outside, the creek murmured beneath its skin of ice, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out to the night. Clara extinguished the lamp and locked the door, stepping out into the cold. Above her, the sky stretched wide and infinite, filled with stars that had witnessed every moment of this small, forgotten town's history. And as she walked home beneath that vast expanse, she thought about Elias Boone, the man who'd come to her broken and left whole, only to return broken again so he could be rebuilt into something stronger. She thought about honor and redemption and the courage it took to face your mistakes head on. And she thought about tomorrow, when the bell would ring and students would fill the new schoolhouse and learning would begin again. Not just letters and numbers, but lessons in grace, in forgiveness, in the quiet, stubborn belief that people, given the chance, could always choose to be better than they were. And when the bell's echo faded into dawn, Mercy Creek woke to something it hadn't known in years: grace. Spring returned to the valley like a benediction. The snow melted into silver ribbons that fed the creek until it sang with abundance, its voice carrying across the greening land. Wildflowers burst from the earth in riots of color, purple and gold and crimson, and the cottonwoods unfurled their leaves like prayers offered to the sky. The air grew warm and soft, carrying the scent of sage and new grass and the promise of things beginning again. Clara stood at the window of the Mercy Creek School of Letters, watching her students spill out into the yard for their midday break. 23 children now, ranging from 5-year-old Emma Wade, who still confused her letters, to 14-year-old Thomas Kimball, who could recite poetry from memory. They chased each other through the grass, their laughter rising like birdsong, and Clara felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose, the knowledge that the work she was doing mattered, that it would ripple outward in ways she might never see but could trust were real. Behind her, she heard the scrape of chalk on slate. She turned to see Elias sitting at one of the back desks, the same place he'd occupied all those months ago when he first walked through her door. But everything about him was different now. His hands, still scarred and calloused, moved with confidence across the page. His shoulders no longer hunched with shame, but sat square with quiet dignity. And his eyes, when he looked up and caught her watching, held something she'd never seen in them before: contentment. "How's it coming?" she asked, walking over to him. He held up the slate. On it, in handwriting that was still imperfect but unmistakably his, he'd written a full paragraph, a passage from The Pilgrim's Way, the book she'd given him that first night during the storm. The pilgrim walked, not because the road was easy, but because the destination was worth the journey. And in walking, he discovered that the path itself transformed him, until the man who arrived was not the same man who had departed. Clara read it twice, her throat tightening. "That's beautiful, Elias." "Seemed fitting," he said quietly, "for today. She'd almost forgotten. It had been exactly 6 months since he'd returned to Mercy Creek. 6 months of showing up before dawn to help prepare the schoolhouse, of sitting through lessons with the patience of stone, of working alongside the town to rebuild not just buildings, but trust. 6 months of proving that redemption wasn't a moment, but a practice. "Read it aloud," Clara said. "The children should hear it." Elias's eyes widened. "I don't know if—" "Yes, you do," she smiled. "Trust me." He stood slowly, the slate clutched in his hands like something precious. Clara stepped out onto the porch and rang the bell, its clear voice carrying across the yard. The children stopped their play and began filing back inside, their faces flushed and bright. They settled into their seats, curious, and Clara gestured for Elias to come forward. He walked to the front of the classroom, and for a moment, Clara saw the old fear flicker across his face, the shame of being seen, of being judged, of failing in front of people who mattered. But then he straightened his shoulders, looked down at the slate, and began to read. His voice was low and rough, but it didn't waver. Each word came clear and deliberate, shaped by months of practice and determination. The children listened in rapt silence, their eyes fixed on this man who'd once been a stranger and was now simply part of their world, the man who mended fences and carried firewood and read to them with a voice that knew struggle. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then little Emma Wade began to clap, her small hands coming together in enthusiastic applause. The other children joined in, and soon the schoolhouse filled with the sound of celebration, not for perfect diction or flawless delivery, but for something deeper, for courage, for perseverance, for the simple, profound act of not giving up. Elias's face went red, but he smiled, a real smile, wide and unguarded, and bowed slightly before returning to his seat. Clara caught his eye as he passed, and the gratitude she saw there made her chest ache. "All right," she said, turning to the class. "Let's continue with today's lesson." The afternoon unfolded in its familiar rhythm. Grammar and arithmetic, geography and science. At one point, Jacob Miller raised his hand and asked why the earth was round, and that sparked a debate that carried them through the next hour, with Elias offering observations from his travels and the children arguing theories, with the earnestness of philosophers. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose, Clara felt the pleasant exhaustion that came from a day well spent. The children gathered their things and said their goodbyes, spilling out into the golden light, their voices echoing across the yard. When the last child left, Clara began straightening the classroom, stacking slates and organizing books. Elias remained in his seat, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're still here," she said. "Wanted to help." He stood and began pushing benches back into their rows. "And I wanted to ask you something." Clara paused, a stack of primers in her arms. "What is it?" Elias walked to the window, looking out at the valley bathed in evening light. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what comes next. For the school, I mean. And for the town. What about it? There are other places, like Mercy Creek," he said. "Small towns scattered across the frontier, where children grow up without access to education because their parents can't afford it or there aren't enough teachers. Places where people like me, grown adults who never learned to read, live their whole lives in silence because no one ever showed them another way." Clara set the books down on her desk. "Go on." "I want to help change that." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "I've still got resources, Clara, money that I don't need and don't want. And I've been talking to people, lawyers, educators, folks who know how to build things that last. We could create a foundation, something that funds schools like this one, that trains teachers and provides books and supplies, that makes education accessible to people who've been told they don't deserve it." Clara stared at him, her mind spinning. That's an enormous undertaking. I know, but I can't do it alone." He took a step closer. "I need someone who understands what teaching really means. Someone who's lived it. Someone who can guide the work so it doesn't become just another rich man's vanity project." He paused. "I need you, Clara." Her breath caught. "Elias, not to run it full time," he added quickly. "You belong here, in this classroom, with these children, but as an advisor, a partner, someone who can help me make sure we're doing it right." Clara walked to the window and stood beside him, looking out at the town that had rejected her and then, slowly, grudgingly, accepted her back. She thought about all the children she'd taught over the years and all the ones she'd never reach. Thought about adults like Elias who carried the weight of illiteracy like a stone around their necks, too ashamed to ask for help. "It would have to be done carefully," she said. "Education isn't something you can force on people. It has to be offered with dignity." Agreed. And the teachers would need support. Training, yes, but also respect, fair wages, the understanding that what they're doing is sacred work. Absolutely. Clara turned to look at him. "Why are you doing this? Really?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because someone showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it," he said finally. "Someone believed I was worth teaching, even when I couldn't offer anything in return. And that changed my life." He looked at her, his eyes bright. "I want to give that to as many people as possible. I want to build something that outlasts me, something that matters." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Then yes," she said quietly, "I'll help you." His face broke into a smile so full of relief and joy that it transformed him. "Thank you, thank you." They stood there in the golden light, two people who'd found each other in the midst of brokenness and built something stronger than either of them could have managed alone. Not romance, though there was affection there, deep and abiding, but partnership, friendship, the recognition that some bonds transcended easy definition. "There's something else," Elias said after a moment, "something I've been working on, a surprise." "What kind of surprise?" "The kind you have to see." He walked to the door and held it open. "Come with me?" Curious, Clara followed him outside. The evening air was cool and sweet, and the valley stretched out before them in all its wild, untamed beauty. Elias led her not toward town but toward the creek, where the cottonwoods cast long shadows across the water. They walked in comfortable silence, the sound of the creek growing louder as they approached. And then Clara saw it, a building, small and sturdy, with walls of fresh-cut timber and a roof of cedar shingles, windows on all four sides to let in the light, and above the door, a sign carved in careful letters, "The Mercy Creek Community Library." Clara stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Elias, I know you said the town needed a library," he said, his voice soft, "somewhere people could come to read and learn, no matter their age or circumstance. So I built it. Well, hired people to build it, but I helped." He gestured toward the building with something like pride. It's stocked with books, primers for beginners, classics for advanced readers, practical guides for farmers and tradesmen, everything I could think of that might be useful. Clara walked forward slowly, as if the building might disappear if she moved too fast. She climbed the steps and pushed open the door. Inside, the space was simple but beautiful. Shelves lined the walls filled with books that gleamed in the evening light. A few tables and chairs sat in the center, ready for students and readers. A small stove in the corner to keep the space warm in winter. It was perfect. There's more, Elias said from behind her. He walked to one of the shelves and pulled down a book, a ledger, bound in leather. He opened it and showed her the first page. The Mercy Creek Community Library donated by Elias Boone in honor of Clara Wren, teacher, friend, and the woman who taught me to read. Clara's vision blurred with tears. She looked up at Elias, unable to speak, and he smiled gently. You gave me more than words, Clara, he said. You gave me back my life. This is just a small way of saying thank you. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. It's not small. It's everything. Then we're even. He closed the ledger and placed it carefully back on the shelf. This library belongs to the town now, to anyone who wants to use it. But it started with you, and I wanted you to know that... Clara wiped at her tears, laughing despite herself. You're impossible. I've been told. They stood there in the quiet library as the sun set outside, painting the windows in shades of gold and crimson, and Clara thought about the journey they'd both taken. From that first night when a desperate man walked through her door in the midst of a storm, to this moment, standing in a building that represented not just literacy but hope. The hope that people could change, that communities could heal, that the work of teaching and learning was sacred enough to transform not just individuals, but entire generations. When do we open it? She asked. Tomorrow, if you're ready. I thought we could make it an event. Invite the whole town. Clara nodded. Let's do it. They locked the library and walked back toward town as darkness fell and the first stars appeared overhead. The schoolhouse stood silent and dark, waiting for morning. The town slept, its houses glowing with lamplight, its streets empty and peaceful. And somewhere in the valley, the creek sang its endless song, carrying water from the mountains to the plains, a constant reminder that life moved forward, always forward, even when the path was uncertain. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Clara woke early and dressed with care, her heart racing with anticipation. She walked to the schoolhouse to find Elias already there, sweeping the porch, his face bright with nervous energy. Morning, she said. Morning. He leaned the broom against the wall. Ready for this? I think so. Good. Because I may have told everyone in town. Clara laughed. Of course you did. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered near the library. The entire town, it seemed. Families and farmers, shopkeepers and laborers, children and elders. Even the school board members who'd once called for Clara's dismissal stood at the edge of the crowd, their expressions grudging but curious. Clara stood on the porch of the library, Elias beside her, and looked out at the sea of faces. Some were friendly, some skeptical, some simply curious, but they'd come. That was what mattered. Thank you all for being here, Clara began, her voice carrying across the crowd. When I first came to Mercy Creek, I believed that education was the key to building a better future, and I still believe that. But I've learned something else, too. I've learned that education isn't just about books and lessons. It's about dignity. It's about giving people the tools to claim their own stories, to write their own endings. She gestured toward Elias. Mr. Boone came to this town 6 months ago, searching for something he'd lost, and what he found was a community that, despite its flaws, was willing to give him a second chance. That showed him what redemption looks like, and now he's giving back. This library is his gift to Mercy Creek. But more than that, it's a testament to what we can build when we choose grace over judgment, when we choose hope over fear. The crowd was silent, listening. Clara took a breath and continued. This library is open to everyone, young and old, rich and poor, those just learning their letters and those who've read 1,000 books. Come here to learn. Come here to teach. Come here to discover that you are more than you thought you were. She stepped back, and Elias moved forward. He pulled a ribbon from his pocket, simple red cloth, and tied it across the door. Then he produced a pair of scissors and held them out to Clara. "Would you do the honors?" he asked. She took the scissors, her hands trembling slightly, and cut the ribbon. It fell away, and the crowd erupted in applause, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, until the sound echoed across the valley. The doors opened, and people began to file inside. Clara watched as children ran to the shelves, their eyes wide with wonder, watched as adults moved more cautiously, reverently, as if stepping into a church, watched as Elias stood to the side, his hands in his pockets, a small smile on his face, and then she saw something that made her heart swell. Samuel Patterson, the preacher's son, walked up to Elias with a book in his hands, The Pilgrim's Way, the same book Clara had given Elias that first night. "Mr. Boone," the boy said shyly, "would you read this to us? Miss Wren says you're real good now." Elias looked surprised, then touched. "I'd be honored." He took the book and walked to one of the tables, where a group of children quickly gathered around him. Clara moved closer, watching as he opened the book with careful hands and began to read. His voice was steady now, confident. The words flowed without hesitation, without shame, and the children listened, their faces rapt, as he read about pilgrims and journeys and the transformative power of walking toward something better. Clara felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed before. These were tears of joy, of fulfillment, of witnessing the impossible become real. She thought about that first night when Elias had stumbled over the alphabet, his hands trembling, his voice thick with desperation. And she thought about now, with him reading to a room full of children, his voice strong and sure. This was what teaching was for. This was what it meant to change a life. When the reading ended and the children applauded, Elias looked up and met Clara's eyes across the room. And in that look was everything they'd never said aloud, gratitude and respect and the deep, abiding recognition that they'd saved each other. Not in the way stories usually told it, with grand gestures and dramatic declarations, but in the quiet, persistent way that real salvation happened, through showing up, through doing the work, through choosing, day after day, to be better than they'd been. The afternoon drifted into evening, and the library slowly emptied as families returned home for supper. Clara and Elias remained, straightening books and pushing chairs back into place. "Thank you," Elias said as they worked. "For everything. For believing in me when no one else did. For giving me a reason to become the man I wanted to be. You did that yourself," Clara said. "I just provided the tools. And the faith. Don't forget the faith," she smiled. "All right." And the faith. They finished their work and walked outside. The sun was setting now, the sky ablaze with color. The valley stretched out before them, endless and beautiful, full of possibility. "What will you do now?" Clara asked. "Once the foundation is established and running?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said finally. "Keep learning, I suppose. There's still so much I don't know, so much I want to understand. And maybe," he trailed off, a faint smile playing at his lips, "maybe I'll try my hand at writing. Not books or anything grand, just letters, stories, things I want to remember. I'd like to read them," Clara said. "When you're ready to share, you'll be the first." They stood there in the fading light, two people who'd walked through fire and emerged not unscathed but stronger, not unchanged but better. And as the stars began to appear overhead, Clara thought about the children she'd taught and would teach, about the lives that would be changed by this library, by the foundation Elias would build, by the simple, revolutionary act of believing that everyone deserved access to knowledge. She thought about Elias's question, all those months ago, when he'd asked her what made surviving worthwhile, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that this was her answer. This moment, this work, this quiet, powerful belief that teaching could heal the world, one student at a time. "Come on," she said, turning toward the schoolhouse. "I've got one more lesson for you before the day's done." "What's that?" She smiled. "How to write a proper thank you letter. You've got a lot of people to write to, if we're going to build this foundation right." Elias laughed, a real full laugh that echoed across the empty yard. "All right, teacher, lead the way." They walked together toward the schoolhouse, their shadows long on the ground, the evening light turning everything soft and golden. Behind them, the library stood silent and ready, its windows reflecting the last rays of the sun. Ahead of them, the schoolhouse waited, its bell tower reaching toward the sky, and above it all, the stars emerged one by one, ancient and unchanging, bearing witness to this small town in this forgotten valley where two people had found redemption in the most unlikely place. In chalk dust and books, in lessons and letters, in the quiet, stubborn belief that people could always choose to be better. That grace, once offered, could transform the world. Months turned into years, and the Mercy Creek School of Letters flourished. Children who'd learned to read went on to teach their own children. The library became the heart of the town, a gathering place where knowledge was shared freely and everyone, regardless of station, was welcome. And the foundation Elias and Clara built together spread across the frontier, funding schools and training teachers and changing lives in ways they could never have imagined. Elias never returned to St. Louis. He made his home in Mercy Creek, living simply in a small house near the creek, spending his days working with his hands and his evenings, reading and writing by lamplight. He became part of the town's fabric, not as a wealthy benefactor or a man to be pitied, but simply as Elias, the man who'd learned to read late in life and devoted the rest of it to making sure others didn't have to wait as long as he did. And Clara continued teaching, her classroom always full, her heart always open. She grew old there, in that schoolhouse, watching generations of children pass through its doors. And when she was too old to teach anymore, when her hands grew stiff with arthritis and her eyes too dim to read by lamplight, she would sit on the porch and listen to the new teacher, one of her former students, lead lessons inside. On a warm spring morning, years after the library opened, Clara sat on that porch with Elias beside her. They were both old now, their hair silver, their faces lined with the beautiful wreckage of time. But their eyes were still bright, still sharp, still filled with the light of purpose. "Do you remember that first night?" Clara asked. "When you came to the schoolhouse in the storm?" Elias smiled, every detail. "I was terrified. So was I. You didn't show it. Neither did you. Not really." She reached over and took his hand, her fingers threading through his. "I'm glad you came, Elias. I'm glad the storm brought you to my door. So am I." He squeezed her hand gently. "You saved my life, Clara, and you saved mine." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the valley bloom with spring, listening to the children's laughter drift from the schoolhouse, feeling the warmth of the sun on their faces. And when the bell rang, clear and bright and full of promise, they smiled, because this was their legacy. Not wealth or property or buildings that would one day crumble, but this, the sound of children learning, the sight of people choosing to be better, the knowledge that education offered with dignity and grace could change everything. The dawn settled over Mercy Creek like forgiveness itself, quiet, endless, and earned. And in the light of that dawn, two people who'd found each other in darkness sat together, their work done, their hearts at peace, their lives a testament to the simple, profound truth that kindness, when given freely, could transform not just one life, but countless others. That teaching was sacred work, that redemption was always possible. And that sometimes the greatest fortunes weren't the ones you inherited, but the ones you built with your own hands, one word, one choice, one act of grace at a time.